I think a good rule of thumb is to think about, is there something going on in either the way you are being sexual in your thoughts or in your behavior that feels like there's a lot of preoccupation or it's difficult to stop despite negative consequences for doing so. So you've tried and you've been unable to stop and you find yourself repeating behavior that you swore you didn't want to do again.
What's your carnal theory?
Internationally, in the ICD-11, there is a diagnosis, for compulsive sexual behavior disorder, and that's sort of where I think the field is going. But part of why I think there's so much debate about whether or not "quote unquote" sex addiction is real is because there can be a lot of stigma and shaming attached to the addiction model, certainly, and people who do not find solace in that label and, in fact, experience a lot of shaming and a lot of judgment when they are called an addict, even though some people find a lot of reprieve and a lot of safety in having a label for what they're experiencing. So in terms of other addictions, I mean, there are all of the chemical addictions, and then, of course, other process addictions, which is clinical speak for behavioral addictions. And those include things like gambling disorder or food-related compulsive strategies, shopping addictions, exercise addictions. So there are a lot of things that we do compulsively that don't carry the same stigma as sex. And I think that's because in our culture, and in most cultures in the world, sex is still something that's so secret, so hush-hush, and so stigmatized, even though it's natural.
Can you give some suggestions if someone is finding themselves in question, or potentially are there check boxes like, if yes to these 3 out of 5 items, you may want to go and talk with a professional?
Yeah, absolutely. There are actually some really great sex addiction screening tests online. People in opposition of sex addiction will have critiques about the potential for sex negativity bias in those assessment tools. So I do think that's important to watch for because it definitely can be there. But I think a good rule of thumb is to think about, is there something going on in either the way you are being sexual in your thoughts or in your behavior that feels like there's a lot of preoccupation or it's difficult to stop despite negative consequences for doing so. So you've tried and you've been unable to stop and you find yourself repeating behavior that you swore you didn't want to do again. Are you experiencing any kind of tolerance, meaning that you are seeking out more or more extreme versions of something related to sex, again, either in thought or in behavior, in order to achieve the same kind of release, orgasm, or pleasure or relief? And are you experiencing any kind of changes in your mood? Some people might call this a post-acute withdrawal symptom. So difficulty sleeping, higher levels of irritability, problems with or changes in your appetite, sadness, depression, suicidality, either in the buildup or in the after effect of being sexual. So anything like that that's going on might be a cue to kind of check in with a professional and see what's going on. Because sometimes there's a compulsivity problem and sometimes there's another mental health condition that's underlying. And if you address that, then the compulsive sexual behavior really comes to a halt.
Thank you for that. And equally important, are there, I realize the same identifiers can be applied, but are there potentially different identifiers and different steps to take if you are someone who feels you are in a relationship with someone who may have a addiction?
Yeah. So working with betrayed partners or prospectively betrayed partners, if you're not quite sure if your partner has a sex or a porn addiction, is interesting because let me just back up and say this. When somebody is betrayed sexually, it often can leave a wake of symptoms in their lives that looks similar to the PTSD that someone might experience following an actual sexual assault. So I really want to emphasize the destruction that sexual betrayal can cause in a person's life. It can leave someone questioning their reality, questioning who they are as a person. Their sexuality might be completely upended, meaning they might become more hypersexual or they might become sexually averse. They can engage in all kinds of self-soothing strategies because it's a real trauma. And when the foundation of our most important relationships in life, and there are a few others, more important than our primary partner as adults, when the bedrock of that gets shaken, it's really difficult to put those pieces back together. And many partners find themselves trying to pool resources toward the addicted or compulsive partner so they can get help. All the while, especially if there are children, they're sort of holding down the fort, trying to assuage their own trauma and make sense of it all. And they can feel really isolated, scared, and alone. So if anyone out there is listening, if you're having some suspicions, if it's starting to impact you, definitely help is out there for you. And there are many of us who are certified to work with betrayal trauma and can help and take a very active stance against victim blaming or shaming you for wanting to stay or leave. It's a complicated labyrinth, the way that sex becomes the vehicle for emotional regulation or becomes the vehicle to act out our unmet needs, maybe is another way to think about that. Could more effective sex education help disentangle some of that? Yes, I think it could. I'm not going to go so far as to say there's a causal relationship there because I would have to do that research or see that research.
Totally.
But I think one of the things that's important for people to understand is that part of the reason that compulsive sexual behavior develops is because sometimes sexual stimulation is something that we learn very early on in life, feels good before we have moral judgments around it, right? Children have been observed to play with their genitals, from a very early age. In fact, there are even some studies that have demonstrated fetuses engaging in genital stimulation in the womb. So I know I saw that head tilt.
So interesting. Wow.
Yeah. Well, guess what? Our genitals, when you stimulate them, they tend to feel good. And it's not until we layer on all this shame around it that starts to be something that, feels not okay. So what I think could happen is if we could, without shame and stigma, educate people earlier, one, we would see an increase in appropriate consent and better sexual boundaries and less offending happening. Two, I think that we would create a context where people can talk about the exposure that they've had to sex or sexually explicit material earlier on, so people could, if they have had a sexual trauma or have been exposed to something that felt overwhelming, they could talk about it and get help earlier and reduce the likelihood that sex would become the vehicle for their emotional regulation in that way, right? In a not healthy way.